Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. On April 15, 2013, more than 26,000 runners crossed through downtown Boston for the 117th running of the Boston Marathon, and somewhere near the finish line on Boylston Street, two homemade pressure cooker bombs sat inside backpacks on the ground, packed with nails, BBs, and ball bearings, waiting for the crowds to thicken. 12 seconds apart, they detonated. 3 people were killed instantly. More than 260 were wounded. 17 people lost limbs that afternoon. And one of the 2 men responsible for all of it was 19 years old. Crystal Marie Campbell was 29, a restaurant manager from Medford who had come out to cheer the runners. Lingzi Liu was 23, a Chinese exchange student at Boston University. The youngest victim was an 8-year-old boy who had gone to the finish line to watch his father complete the race. He never made it home. 4 days later, Officer Sean Collier, a 27-year-old campus police officer at MIT, would be ambushed and shot to death while sitting in his patrol car during the manhunt that followed. None of these people had ever met the Tsarnaev brothers. None of them had done anything except show up on a spring afternoon in Boston. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his older brother Tamerlan, who was 26, had planned the bombing as jihadist retaliation for American military operations in Muslim countries. They assembled the pressure cooker devices, carried them in backpacks through the crowd, set them down near the finish line among families and spectators, and walked away before the explosions tore through the grandstands. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in American law enforcement history. The FBI released surveillance images of both brothers on April 18th, and within hours, the situation spiraled out of control. That same night, the brothers murdered Officer Collier on the MIT campus, carjacked an SUV at gunpoint, and triggered a rolling firefight with police through the streets of Watertown. Tamerlan was killed during that confrontation. He was shot by police and then run over by his own brother as Dzhokhar fled in the stolen vehicle. For roughly 20 hours, the entire city of Boston went into lockdown. The next evening, a Watertown resident noticed blood on the shrink-wrapped cover of a dry-docked boat in his backyard and called it in. Inside, curled up and bleeding, was Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. He had scratched a message into the boat's interior wall, calling the victims collateral damage and framing the attack as payback for American wars abroad. He was 19 years old, wounded, hiding in a boat, and he had just helped carry out the deadliest terror attack on American soil since September 11th. His trial began in federal court in Boston in early 2015, and the defense made an unusual choice. They admitted in opening statements that Dzhokhar had done it. The only question left for the jury was whether he would live or die for it. In March, the jury convicted him on all 30 counts, including use of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. In May, they voted unanimously to impose the death penalty on 6 of those counts. And somehow, it gets worse. Because the legal fight over his sentence has now stretched for more than a decade. The First Circuit Court of Appeals vacated the death sentence in July of 2020, citing problems with how jurors were screened for pretrial publicity and the exclusion of evidence about Tamerlan's possible role in an earlier unsolved triple murder in Waltham, Massachusetts. That ruling did not free Tsarnaev. It simply took execution off the table. Then, in March of 2022, the United States Supreme Court reversed the First Circuit 6-3 and put the death penalty back on. Justice Clarence Thomas, writing for the majority, stated that Tsarnaev had committed heinous crimes, but that the Sixth Amendment guaranteed him a fair trial before an impartial jury, and he received one. The First Circuit judge who had originally struck down the sentence had already made the stakes plain. She wrote that there should be no mistake. Dzhokhar would spend his remaining days locked up in prison, and the only matter left was whether the government would execute him. Bill and Denise Richard, the parents of the 8-year-old boy killed at the finish line, published a piece in the Boston Globe in 2015 asking prosecutors to drop the death penalty entirely. They did not want years of appeals and news cycles. They wanted Tsarnaev to disappear from the public consciousness and never be heard from again. As of 2026, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev sits in ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, on federal death row. No execution date has been set. The case was sent back to the First Circuit to address remaining issues, including juror bias claims tied to social media posts by 2 members of the original jury. In July of 2025, the court denied his petition to force the recusal of Judge George O'Toole, the trial judge. President Biden declined to commute his sentence. The Trump administration has restored federal executions, but Tsarnaev's date has not been scheduled. He was 19 when he helped kill 4 people and maim hundreds more. He is now in his early 30s, locked inside the most secure federal prison in the country, and the legal system still has not finished deciding how his story ends. That level of carnage came from a pair of homemade bombs and 2 brothers with a grievance. But the case coming next involved something far more intimate and far more cold-blooded. T.J. Lane. On the morning of February 27, 2012, students at Chardon High School in Geauga County, Ohio, roughly 30 miles east of Cleveland, were sitting in the cafeteria eating breakfast before first period. It was a Monday. Around 7:30 in the morning, a 17-year-old named Thomas Lane III walked in carrying a Ruger Mark III .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a knife. He was not a student at Chardon High. He was waiting for a bus to Lake Academy, an alternative school in the area. He sat near a table of students he did not really know, raised the weapon, and fired 10 rounds. 3 students were killed. Daniel Parmertor, 16, Demetrius Hewlin, 16, Russell King Jr., 17, who died the next day after he was removed from life support. 3 more students were wounded, including Joy Rickers, Nate Mueller, and Nick Walczak, who was left paralyzed from the attack. Lane never gave a coherent explanation for what he did. Prosecutors told the court the shooting was entirely random. There was no bullying dispute, no grudge, no manifesto. He just walked in and started firing. When the shots rang out, assistant football coach Frank Hall charged directly at Lane and chased him out of the building. That decision almost certainly saved lives. Lane was apprehended by police a short distance from the school shortly after. Chardon is a small town, roughly 5,000 people. Everybody knew somebody who was in that cafeteria that morning. The community was devastated, and Lane offered nothing. No explanation, no breakdown, no motive that made any of it make sense to anyone. Ohio could not sentence him to death. Under Roper versus Simmons, the state cannot execute anyone who was a juvenile at the time of the crime. But the case was transferred to adult court, and in February of 2013, Lane pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. There was no trial, no defense argument, just a guilty plea entered without emotion. Here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. It was not the shooting itself that burned this case into public memory. It was the sentencing hearing on March 19, 2013. Lane stood before Judge David Fury in Geauga County Common Pleas Court, unbuttoned his dress shirt in front of the courtroom, and revealed a white T-shirt underneath with the word "killer" hand-scrawled across it in marker. Then he delivered a vulgar, sexually explicit taunt directed at the families of the students he had murdered grinned, and raised his middle finger to the entire courtroom. That's not a typo, by the way. A 17-year-old mass killer stood in a courtroom and mocked the parents of the children he had shot to death. Judge Furry called it a merciless rampage and told the court he had not been provided a clear motive, or even a murky one. He found that Lane had exhibited a total lack of compassion, with absolutely no remorse. Dina Parmertor, Daniel's mother, stood before the court and said that from that day forward, her son's killer would only ever be known as a killer, and that she wanted him to feel her anger toward him. The sentence was 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 37 years. He would never leave prison. That was the plan, anyway. And no, I'm not making that up. On September 11th, 2014, Lane and 2 other inmates scaled a fence and escaped from the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio, a medium-security facility. He was on the run for roughly 6 hours before being recaptured, about 100 yards from the prison perimeter, hiding behind a church. After the escape, he was transferred to the Ohio State Penitentiary, the state's supermax facility in Youngstown. He remains there today with no successful appeals, no realistic prospect of release, and no path out. Almost nobody ever heard about this part of the story, but the case that follows makes Lane's courtroom theatrics look almost restrained by comparison. Tyler Hadley. On the night of July 16, 2011, roughly 60 teenagers showed up to a house party at a home on Grandeur Avenue in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Music was playing. People were in the backyard. It was the kind of unremarkable summer gathering that happens in every Florida suburb. And inside the locked master bedroom, separated from the party by a single door, the bodies of the host's parents lay on the floor where he had dragged them. Tyler Hadley was 17 years old, 154 days from his 18th birthday. Earlier that evening, he had picked up a 22-inch claw hammer and beaten his mother, Mary Jo Hadley, to death as she sat at the family computer. When his father Blake came running at the sound, Hadley killed him too. The forensic evidence showed roughly 70 blows between the two of them. He dragged both bodies into the master bedroom, locked the door behind him, cleaned the visible blood with bleach, and then picked up his phone and sent out text invitations to about 60 people for a party at his house that night. Blake Hadley was 54, an information technology specialist for Florida Power and Light. Mary Jo Hadley was 47 and taught at a local middle school. The sentencing judge would later describe them as loving and attentive parents, noting their one failing had been inconsistency with discipline. The party went on for hours. Investigators later confirmed that some of the guests had been standing just feet from where the bodies were hidden. Nobody smelled anything. Nobody noticed the locked door. Hadley moved through the crowd as though nothing had happened, talking, drinking, acting like any other teenager hosting a house party while his parents were supposedly out of town. Then, sometime that night, he pulled aside a friend named Michael Mandel and told him the truth. He confessed. Mandel did not confront him or run. He went to the police. Hadley was arrested on July 17, 2011. He was charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Methamphetamine and ecstasy use were part of the defense argument, but the sequence of events, the cleanup, the bleach, the locked door, the party invitations, all of it told prosecutors this was not a drug-fueled blackout. It was calculated. In 2014, Hadley pleaded no contest to both counts and received 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. The prosecutor at sentencing told the court that the nature of this double homicide cried out for a life sentence, just as the screams from his parents had cried out for life as he was killing them with that hammer. He said Hadley deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which prohibited mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders, changed the legal landscape for cases exactly like this one. Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal vacated Hadley's sentence and ordered a new hearing. The lead prosecutor was devastated. He told reporters he felt physically ill and that the only people being re-victimized were the victims themselves. In October of 2018, the resentencing hearing took place before Judge Robert Belanger. Hadley's public defender told the court that her client was and is very remorseful and had suffered from severe mental illness since he was a little boy. The judge considered the argument and reimposed the life sentence. Tyler Hadley remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections. No further appeals have succeeded. He killed both of his parents with a hammer, hid their bodies behind a locked door, threw a party in the same house, and the law decided he would never walk free again. Every case covered so far has involved a killer who was at least close to adulthood. The one coming next involves a boy who was barely old enough to drive, and what he did to his own family in their sleep makes Hadley's crime look like it had at least some chaotic logic to it. Nicholas Browning. In the early morning hours of February 2, 2008, a 15-year-old Boy Scout and honor student at Delaney High School in Cockeysville, Maryland, walked home from a friend's house after midnight. He went downstairs to the basement, retrieved his father's .25 caliber handgun, and moved through the house in the dark. By the time he put the weapon down, every other member of his family was dead. John Browning was 45, an attorney. Tamara Browning was 44. Their 2 younger sons were 14 and 11. The investigation revealed that all 4 family members had been killed in their sleep. What the evidence showed was methodical and deliberate, carried out in silence while the house was still. Nicholas was 1 week shy of his 16th birthday. After the killings, he walked back to his friend's house and stayed the night playing video games as if nothing had changed. He slept. He woke up. And the next day, he returned home accompanied by the friend's father, walked into a house he already knew was full of bodies, and pretended to discover them for the first time. His performance was convincing enough that police were initially called to what appeared to be a home invasion. But it did not hold. Within hours, Nicholas Browning confessed to everything. Prosecutors said the motive was control and inheritance. The defense presented a different picture, arguing that the family home was marked by abuse and that Browning suffered from a dissociative disorder. But the prosecution pushed back hard. Assistant State's Attorney Ann Brobst told the court that the dead could not stick up for themselves and that every single person in that house had been murdered except the one person who stood to gain from making abuse claims. She noted that these allegations were impossible to verify because Browning had made sure no one was left alive to contradict him. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. No teacher, no scout leader, no family friend ever raised a red flag about the Browning household before that night. He was charged as an adult. A defense motion to transfer the case to juvenile court was denied. Because of his age, both the death penalty and mandatory life without parole were off the table. In October of 2008, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder in Baltimore County Circuit Court under a plea deal. The sentence came in December. 4 life terms, 2 consecutive and 2 concurrent. Under Maryland's system, he could become technically eligible for parole around 2031, after roughly 23 years served. But Maryland's parole process for lifers requires the governor to sign off, and no governor has approved the release of a lifer since 1994. So the eligibility is theoretical at best. Another prosecutor, Leo Ryan Jr., entered into evidence a recorded jailhouse phone call in which Browning joked about escaping prison. Ryan told the court these were hardly the words of someone racked with guilt and remorse, and called them instead the words of a dangerous killer. At a 2014 hearing, Browning sought a sentence modification that would have moved him to the Patuxent Institution for youth offender treatment. Prosecutor Robin Coffin argued that the crime was so terrible that Nicholas Browning should never be released from jail. Judge Thomas Bullinger Sr. denied the motion. Browning wept at sentencing and told the court he was sorry. At a later hearing, he said that words could not adequately describe what he had done. He remains incarcerated in the Maryland correctional system with no clear path to release. A 15-year-old killed his entire family in their beds, walked away to play video games, and came back the next morning to fake his own grief. But the case that follows starts with something even more chilling. A journal entry about torturing a dog that reads like a warning sign written in neon, and nobody saw it for what it was. Luke Woodham. On the morning of October 1st, 1997, a 16-year-old boy in Pearl, Mississippi put on a long trench coat, concealed a .30-30 lever-action deer rifle underneath it, and drove his mother's car to Pearl High School. Before he ever left the house that morning, he had already committed his first murder. Mary Ann Woodham was 50 years old. She was attacked in her sleep. The autopsy documented 11 slash wounds and 7 stab wounds, including to the heart and lungs. Her son killed her before dawn, then got dressed and drove himself to school. When Woodham arrived at Pearl High, he walked up to a fellow student named Justin Sledge and handed him a written manifesto. Then he entered the commons area and opened fire with the deer rifle. He killed Christina Menifee, 16, his former girlfriend, whose recent breakup with him was the trigger he would later cite. He also killed Lydia K. Dew, who was 17. 7 other students were wounded. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about what happened after the shooting stopped. Assistant Principal Joel Myrick did not call for help and wait. He sprinted to his truck in the school parking lot, grabbed a .45 caliber Colt pistol, ran back, and confronted Woodham directly, holding him at gunpoint until police arrived. Woodham did not fight. He did not try to flee. He had written everything he wanted the world to know, and he had already handed it to someone to deliver. The manifesto, which was read into the court record, declared that he was not insane but angry. He said he killed because people like him were mistreated every day, that he had been ridiculed and beaten and hated throughout his entire life, and that this was his way of showing society what happens when you push someone far enough. He also claimed he had been acting on orders from a satanic group he called the Croth, supposedly led by an older acquaintance named Grant Boyette. Investigators looked into it and found little more than a handful of alienated teenagers engaging in dark fantasy. Boyette was eventually convicted of conspiracy and accessory charges, but the so-called group was never shown to be anything organized. Months before the school shooting, Woodham had tortured and killed his own dog. His journal entry about it was entered into evidence. He wrote that the animal's howl sounded almost human, and that they had laughed and hit her hard. That entry tells you more about what was building inside Luke Woodham than any psychiatric evaluation ever could. He was tried as an adult in 2 separate proceedings. The first, for his mother's murder, was held in Neshoba County on a change of venue. The second, for the school killings, was held in Rankin County. His defense team argued insanity in both trials, Both juries rejected it. On June 5, 1998, he was convicted of murdering his mother. 1 week later, on June 12th, he was convicted of 2 counts of murder and 7 counts of aggravated assault for the shootings at Pearl High. The sentence was 3 life terms, 1 for each victim, plus 7 consecutive 20-year terms for the aggravated assaults. That amounts to 3 life sentences plus 140 additional years. Under Mississippi law, he becomes parole eligible in 2046 at the age of 65. He has tried every available route out. Former Governor Haley Barbour denied his clemency request in 2011. After the Supreme Court's rulings in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana opened the door for juvenile offenders to challenge their sentences, Woodham filed for parole eligibility review in 2016. The Mississippi Supreme Court denied post-conviction relief. Every legal avenue has been exhausted. Luke Woodham is held at the South Mississippi Correctional Institution, listed as inmate R4682. He has been behind bars for nearly 3 decades. He killed his own mother in her sleep, drove her car to school, killed 2 classmates, wounded 7 more, handed a manifesto to a student explaining exactly why he did it, and tortured an animal months beforehand as though he were practicing. The state of Mississippi has made it clear, through every ruling and every denied petition, that they have no intention of ever letting him walk free. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Aiden Zellmer. In June of 2017, a 10-year-old girl in Thornton, Colorado, left her house with a 15-year-old boy she knew, telling her family they were walking to a nearby shopping center. She never came back. When volunteers found her body the next morning in a ravine near 128th Avenue and Jasmine Street, the scope of what had happened was staggering, and the boy who had led her out of the house was still standing with the search party when they found her. Aiden Zellmer lived in the same household as the child he killed. Her mother was dating his mother's partner, and the two had been placed under the same roof. They were not strangers. They shared a home. On the evening of June 7th, around 7 in the evening, he told the family they were walking to a nearby shopping center. He led her instead to an isolated natural area on the edge of the neighborhood, a stretch of open land near a ravine that nobody in Thornton paid much attention to. What the investigation uncovered was described in court filings as deliberate and premeditated. The child was harmed fatally. Investigators also found evidence of additional abuse. She was 10 years old. After the killing, Zellmer returned to the family and told them the two had been separated during a rainstorm. He looked her family in the eye and lied. When the search began that night, he participated. He helped hand out flyers. He answered questions. The district attorney would later describe him as calm, cool, and collected, while he misled police and misdirected the investigation. He was 15 years old, and he sat across from detectives and lied about everything without breaking composure. He was initially charged as a juvenile, but on January 23, 2018, the case was transferred to adult court. In February of 2019, Zellmer pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder after deliberation. The remaining charges were dismissed as part of the plea agreement. Adams County District Judge Sharon Holbrook sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The district attorney, Dave Young, had spent 27 years as a prosecutor at that point. He told the court that 15-year-olds make bad decisions, but they do not commit cruel and heinous crimes like this. He described the crime in explicit terms, noting how Zellmer had left the child in a field and then walked back to her family and deceived everyone around him with no visible distress. In nearly 3 decades of prosecution, Young said, he had never seen a 15-year-old commit such a violent act. Judge Holbrook told the family at sentencing that the child would not be forgotten. Zellmer was held in a juvenile facility until he turned 18, then transferred to the Colorado Department of Corrections. He will not be eligible for parole until approximately 2059. He will be in his late 50s by then, if it is ever granted at all. One important note on this case: it has gone viral on social media, particularly TikTok, where Zellmer is often identified as a Canadian teen named Aiden Zellmer. That is incorrect. He is American, from Thornton, Colorado, and the case was prosecuted in Adams County. The misinformation has spread widely enough that it has become part of the case's online mythology. But the court records are clear. What happened in that field in Colorado was the act of one teenager against one child, carried out with a level of calm and calculation that stunned even veteran prosecutors. The case that follows involved a 15-year-old who did not stop at one. He killed every person in his family, 5 people in a single night, and the youngest was 2 years old. Nehemiah Griego. On the night of January 19, 2013, police in South Valley, New Mexico, just outside Albuquerque, entered a home in an unincorporated area of Bernalillo County and found 5 members of the same family dead. The youngest was 2 years old. The oldest was 51. The person responsible for all 5 killings was the 15-year-old son who had spent the rest of that day at his father's church, telling people his family had died in an accident. Greg Griego was 51, a former pastor at Calvary Church and a chaplain for the Albuquerque Fire Department. He spent his career serving the community, counseling grieving families, and running programs at a local homeless shelter. Sarah Griego was 40. Their other children were 9, 5, and 2. The investigation determined that Nehemiah had carried out the killings over the course of several hours, beginning around midnight, using firearms taken from his parents' closet. What the evidence showed was methodical. The autopsy findings were consistent with prolonged, deliberate action. Nehemiah told investigators that after harming his mother, his 9-year-old brother woke up and did not believe what had happened. By Nehemiah's own account to police, he showed the boy evidence to convince him. The boy was then killed. Nehemiah moved through the house and took the lives of both of his younger sisters. Then he waited. His father did not arrive home from an overnight shift at a homeless shelter until around 5 in the morning. His father was killed at the door. Nehemiah spent the rest of the day at Calvary Church with his 12-year-old girlfriend, telling her and other church members that the family had died in an accident. He maintained the lie for hours. It only fell apart when a retired homicide detective who attended the church grew suspicious after Nehemiah's story changed between tellings. The detective called 911. When investigators finally questioned Nehemiah, he told them he had been having homicidal and suicidal thoughts for some time, that he was angry at his mother, and that he had planned to drive to a Walmart afterward and die in a confrontation with police. He never followed through on the second part of the plan. He just went to church instead. The legal proceedings in this case dragged on for years. Nehemiah was initially handled in New Mexico Children's Court. In 2016, Judge John Romero found him amenable to treatment as a juvenile, which under New Mexico law would have meant release at age 21. Prosecutors appealed. The New Mexico Court of Appeals reversed in 2019, and Second Judicial District Judge Elisa Hart issued a 75-page order finding Nehemiah was not amenable to treatment as a juvenile and should be sentenced as an adult. He had already pleaded guilty in October of 2015 to 2 counts of second-degree murder for his parents and 3 counts of child abuse resulting in death for his siblings. Judge Hart sentenced him in November of 2019 to 3 concurrent life sentences for the children, each life term carrying 30 years under New Mexico law, plus 2 concurrent 7-year terms for the parents. He becomes parole eligible around 2050 at age 52, with credit for time already served. Hart wrote in her sentencing order that what was needed to balance both what was best for the community and what was best for Nehemiah did not currently exist as a resource for the court to consider. She concluded that placing him on probation and treatment would create an unacceptable level of risk to the community. Bernalillo County Sheriff Manny Gonzalez called the sentencing the final chapter of justice for the 5 victims, some of whom were innocent children. The defense attorney, Stephen Taylor, said it is easy to give up on children who commit terrible crimes and write them off as hopeless. In March of 2024, the New Mexico Supreme Court upheld the sentence, rejecting Nehemiah's argument that 3 life terms for a juvenile constituted cruel and unusual punishment. He remains in the New Mexico Department of Corrections. 5 people killed in a single night by a 15-year-old, and the legal system spent 6 years deciding whether he should be treated as a child or punished as an adult. The case coming next did not take nearly as long to resolve, but the crime itself was committed in a place that should have been the safest room in the building. Michael Hernandez. On the morning of February 3, 2004, a teacher at Southwood Middle School in Palmetto Bay, Florida noticed blood on a 14-year-old student's clothing as he walked into class. The student was Michael Hernandez. He had just come from the boys' restroom. When staff went to check, they found Hernandez's best friend and classmate, Jaime Guff, also 14, dead inside a handicapped stall. Hernandez had lured Jaime into the stall that morning before classes started, telling him he had something to show him. What followed, according to the autopsy and court proceedings, was a violent and premeditated attack. Jaime was harmed fatally. The scope of the injuries pointed to sustained, deliberate violence. Hernandez concealed the weapon in a hidden compartment he had built into his backpack and walked to class as though nothing had happened. He sat through the start of the school day, with blood still on his clothes, until the teacher noticed and called for help. The gap between the killing and the discovery was measured in minutes, and at those minutes, Hernandez sat at his desk. This was not a sudden eruption. It was not a fight that escalated. Hernandez had been keeping a journal, and what investigators found inside it rewrote the entire narrative of who this 14-year-old was. He had listed people he wanted to kill, including his own sister and Jaime Guff by name. He wrote about what he called a mission to cleanse the planet. He expressed detailed admiration for Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. One entry, later read into the record by a forensic psychologist, contained operational instructions to himself. Make sure they are dead. Make sure no one else is in the bathroom. If so, kill them. A 14-year-old had written a step-by-step plan for murder in a school notebook, and nobody had seen it until it was too late. He was charged as an adult. In 2008, a Miami-Dade jury rejected his insanity defense and convicted him of first-degree murder. The mandatory sentence at the time was life without the possibility of parole. He was locked away, and that appeared to be the end of it. Then came Miller versus Alabama in 2012, made retroactive by Montgomery versus Louisiana in 2016. Because Hernandez had been a juvenile at the time of the crime, he was entitled to a resentencing hearing. In February of 2016, he appeared before Judge John Schlesinger and addressed the court. He told Jaime's family he wanted to apologize and that he was sorry for what he did. He said it hurt him how senseless it was, because Jaime had always been such a good friend to him. The prosecution was unmoved. During cross-examination of Hernandez's father, the prosecutor asked whether it concerned him that his son continued to be fascinated with serial killers and music that glorified violence. Jaime's parents, Jorge and Maria Guff, submitted a letter that was read in court. They wrote that Michael had committed an atrocious act of violence against their son, that they had been devastated by the decision he made that day, and that he remained a threat to the community. Judge Schlesinger reimposed the life sentence, finding that Hernandez's rehabilitation potential was low. The Third District Court of Appeal upheld the sentence in 2018. There would be no second chance. Michael Hernandez died in prison on April 29, 2021, at the age of 31. He was incarcerated at Columbia Correctional Institution near Jacksonville. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as cardiac dysrhythmia attributed to morbid obesity. Jaime's father, Jorge, responded publicly. He told reporters that he was sorry this had happened to the Hernandez family, and that as parents, they understood how it feels. After everything that had been taken from his own family, he chose empathy. A 14-year-old killed his best friend in a school bathroom after writing out the plan in a journal. He died in prison 17 years later, and even then the victim's father responded with grace. But the case that follows is one where the killer did not just take a life. He hid the evidence inside his own bedroom for an entire week while a neighborhood searched. Joshua Phillips. In November of 1998, an 8-year-old girl in the Lakewood neighborhood of Jacksonville, Florida, went across the street to ask a neighbor's son to come outside and play baseball. Her name was known to the entire community within days, but she never came home that afternoon. For the next 7 days, hundreds of volunteers and police officers combed the neighborhood, knocked on every door, and stapled flyers to telephone poles. The 14-year-old boy she had gone to visit joined the search effort alongside everyone else. He spoke with police. He cooperated with every request. He even sat on his own bed petting his dog while investigators stood in his room asking questions. And the entire time, the child's body was concealed inside the frame of his waterbed, directly beneath where he was sitting. Joshua Phillips was 14 years old. The child had come over asking to play baseball while his parents were out at work. What happened next, by Phillips's own account given to investigators after his arrest, began with an accident. He said he hit her in the face with a baseball bat and panicked because his father was abusive, and he feared the consequences if anyone found out. He brought her inside. She was still alive, crying. He did not call for help. According to the forensic evidence, the child was harmed fatally after being brought into the home. The autopsy found injuries consistent with a prolonged and deliberate act. Phillips then concealed her body inside the waterbed frame and went about his week. On November 10th, 7 days after the child disappeared, Phillips's mother, Melissa, noticed a wet spot on his bedroom floor. She looked under the waterbed mattress and found the body. Police arrested Phillips at school within hours, he confessed. A retired Jacksonville Sheriff's Office sergeant, who had interviewed Phillips during the search, described him as cool as a cucumber. He said the boy had sat on the bed, petting his dog, completely unemotional and unaffected by law enforcement being in his house. Thinking about it now, the sergeant said, it was chilling. Phillips was charged as an adult and convicted of first-degree murder in 1999. The mandatory sentence was life without parole. Following the Miller v. Alabama decision and Florida's juvenile sentencing reforms, he received a resentencing hearing in 2017. The court imposed life in prison with a sentence review after 25 years, which is Florida's remedy for juvenile offenders. At the resentencing, Phillips addressed the family directly. He told them he did not pretend to know or understand their pain or to grasp the void he had created in their lives. He said he had done something horrible and that he was sorry. The child's mother, Sheila DeLongis, responded publicly in 2025. She said her daughter did not get a second chance. She did not get to grow up, graduate, fall in love, or have a family of her own. Her daughter's sentence was final, and the killer's should be too. The child's sister said he had the chance to get help twice while the girl was still alive, and he chose not to. She said she could not see past that, regardless of whether someone called it a child's brain or an adult's brain. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear Phillips's further appeal in 2020. Then, in May of 2026, Phillips voluntarily withdrew his application for the 25-year sentence review after a state-appointed expert issued a critical evaluation. In a handwritten filing, he wrote that he wished to convey his deepest apologies to the family for the reopening of wounds that any legal action in his case surely caused. He remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections, with no current path to release. A 14-year-old hid a child's body in his own bed for a week, joined the search, lied to police, and sat on that bed while investigators questioned him. He stayed in the room with the evidence and did not flinch. The last case on this list involves a girl who did something remarkably similar. She planned, she killed, she attended a church event that same night, and she wrote about it in her diary like it was a highlight of her week. Alyssa Bustamante. Several days before October 21, 2009, a 15-year-old girl in St. Martins, Missouri, went into the woods behind her grandmother's house and dug 2 shallow graves. She prepared them in advance. She had a plan, and she had a target. On October 21st, she had her younger sister Emma invite the neighbor girl, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton, out to play. Then she sent Emma away. Elizabeth lived 4 houses down the road. She was a child who had done nothing to anyone. Bustamante lured her into the woods, promising a surprise. What happened there was described by investigators as deliberate and premeditated. The child was harmed fatally. The autopsy found injuries consistent with strangulation and additional wounds. Elizabeth was 9 years old. That evening, Bustamante attended a church youth dance. The family was active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Bustamante went to the event while volunteers and neighbors began organizing a search for the missing girl. She did not say a word. 2 days later, she led police to the body. What sealed this case was her diary. The entry for the night of October 21st was recovered by investigators. In it, she described what she had done using the word amazing, spelled with an H, and called the experience pretty enjoyable. When questioned, she told investigators she just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. She was 15. Bustamante's background contained its own darkness. Her grandparents had custody of her since 2002. In 2007, she had been hospitalized for a suicide attempt. On her YouTube profile, which investigators pulled during the case, she had listed her hobbies as cutting and killing people. The signs had been visible. Nobody connected them until a 9-year-old was dead. She was originally charged with first-degree murder. In January of 2012, on the eve of trial, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. Cole County Circuit Judge Patricia Joyce sentenced her on February 8, 2012 to life in prison with the possibility of parole on the murder charge, plus a consecutive 30 years on the armed criminal action count. Prosecutors had asked for 101 years. At sentencing, Bustamante addressed the Olton family and said if she could give her life to bring Elizabeth back, she would. The Cole County Sheriff at the time called it the worst murder he had seen in 33 years. Cole County Prosecutor Locke Thompson told the court that the pain this crime inflicted was ongoing. This case took another unexpected turn years later. Missouri's 2021 Senate Bill 26 unintentionally opened a loophole. It created juvenile parole eligibility for second-degree murder convicts after 15 years, though it specifically excluded first-degree murder. Because Bustamante had pleaded to second-degree murder, she fell through the gap. The legislature tried to close it with Senate Bill 754, but Governor Mike Parson did not sign in time to block her hearing. On July 8, 2024, Bustamante appeared before the parole board. They denied her release. Prosecutor Thompson said his office would vehemently argue against parole at every future hearing, calling the prospect of repeated hearings a reopening of the pain and suffering caused by what he described as a monstrous crime. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for 2029. But even if the board were to grant parole on the life sentence, she would still have to serve the consecutive 30-year term, which carries its own parole eligibility after 15 years. The earliest realistic release date is somewhere around 2059, when she would be 65. She also owes a $5 million civil judgment to Elizabeth's mother, Patricia Price. Alyssa Bustamante is incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Chillicothe, Missouri. She dug 2 graves before she even picked her victim, killed a 9-year-old neighbor, went to a church dance that same night, and wrote about the experience in her diary like it was a good day. The parole board said no. The prosecutor has promised to fight every future attempt, and a mother is still waiting for a justice system that keeps its word. 10 cases, 10 teenagers, 10 crimes committed before any of them turned 20. Some are on death row, some will die behind bars, and every one of them had someone who never came home. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.